Hello, I'm Robert Ellsberg. I'm the publisher of Orbis Books. Very glad to be joined today by Alessandra Harris, who is a new author for us, the author of this really timely and important book called In the Shadow of Freedom, The Enduring Call for Racial Justice. Um, Alessandra is a writer, a religion writer, an essayist, a novelist, co-founder of Black Catholic Messenger. And as I was reading this book, it seemed to me that it really fit within a kind of conversation that has been growing over the last few years. And I think it contributes to that very deeply. We saw in 2020, after the death of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protest, there was, of course, a lot of attention on police violence, particularly directed toward African Americans and people of color. But that led into a deeper conversation about the wider dimensions of systemic racism in America and its roots going back into slavery and Jim Crow segregation. The publication of the 1619 Project, in particular from the New York Times, that you referenced a few times, was an effort to imagine what it would like if we foregrounded racism and slavery in particular as a kind of foundation of American history rather than as some kind of aberration from a long time ago. And that, of course, then provoked another kind of backlash among critics and politicians who went on this tirade against the teaching of what they, so-called critical race theory in elementary schools, trying to ban and suppress books or conversation or teaching in schools about the history of racial oppression or any implication that it continues into our time. So into that kind of trajectory comes your book, and it is just a fascinating, depressing, I have to say, but just eye-opening journey through that whole story, beginning with slavery, and how that foundation of anti-Black racism was carried over and translated into patterns, particularly of mass incarceration, but other kinds of ways of pathologizing and controlling Black bodies that continues. So with that introduction, maybe you could talk a little bit about what inspired you to write this book and how you see it fitting into that conversation.
Well, I was inspired to write the book after the racial justice uprising that happened in 2020. I think that during that time, a lot of people became educated about, like you said, systemic racism. I think before we were familiar with personal racism, and of course, most people did not believe that they were personally racist, but during 2020, people were really exploring the ideas of systemic racism and how intertwined racism is in American society and all of our different structures. And I was particularly moved and felt called by Michelle Alexander, who wrote The
Mm,
New Jim Crow in 2020,
mm,
that really laid bare the problem of mass incarceration. And I felt she had said in a 2020 interview when she was promoting the 10th anniversary that the problem of mass incarceration really requires a moral and spiritual revolution.
mm,
And like you mentioned, I have had the honor to write for religious publications and co-founded Black Catholic Messenger. And I felt like this issue and the deeper issue of police violence and anti-Black racism, wealth inequality really needed to be brought to a Catholic audience.
mm, mm. Well, as I said, you start with the story of slavery, and it was really striking and fascinating to show how the so-called slave codes during that period of patrols that would go around, make sure that you had to have a pass if you were going to leave your plantation, that sort of thing. After slavery, gave way to kind of black codes, where really the same kind of system was applied to emancipated African Americans.
Absolutely. And then I continue when we talk about the drug war. And
Mm,
we talk about how it was the same thing where the national drug abuse studies have shown that white, Black, and Hispanic Americans use drugs at about the same rate.
mhm,
And in numbers, just because there's so many more white people than Black people or Hispanics, white people use drugs the most in numbers.
mm,
But we see during the war on drugs and during the prison boom that the draconian laws and mandatory minimum sentences were mainly used against African Americans and African American males.
mhm,
And like, for example, I talk about the 100-to-1 crack to powder cocaine discrepancy.
mhm,
And they basically are the same substance. But because crack cocaine was mainly used and sold by African Americans versus the powder cocaine, then you saw these disproportionate mandatory minimum sentences. I believe it was 5 years just for having a cocaine base, um, or a crack cocaine base. And you see so many people who are incarcerated because of drug offenses, even marijuana
mhm,
offenses,
mhm.
that were disproportionately African American.
One of the fascinating chapters where you really take that in a striking direction is on the opioid crisis. And of course, there have now been books, Dope Sick, and the Hulu series, kind of a documentary that people are quite familiar with the story of the Sacklers and their role in promoting the opioid addiction. There were two kind of aspects of it that were striking and fit into your narrative. One was the complete discrepancy between kind of white collar crime, between billionaires
Mhm.
who were driving this massive crisis, massive death toll in America. Everybody acknowledges that, uh, and pays some fines, that sort of thing. Versus, as you say, the mass incarceration of low-level street, drug dealers, that sort of thing. Yeah, the second thing about it was I thought the kind of discrepancy in the attitude publicly toward white people who were seen as kind of victims of this predatory pharmaceutical system or whatever, versus black people who were drug addicts,
Mhm.
who were pathologized and treated as kind of dangerous criminals, and it was their fault, and that sort of had to be put away.
Absolutely. And I really did enjoy writing the chapter on the opioid crisis after exploring the drug war
Mm,
that disproportionately targeted African Americans, just so, like you said, you could see that discrepancy, because opiates have just caused so much destruction in our country, and so many lives have been lost because of opiates. But you don't see the Sacklers or any of the CEOs of these companies that were distributing the drugs behind bars. There have not been criminal charges. And then you have some African Americans, I think it was over 3,000 African Americans serving life without parole for nonviolent offenses, and many of them drug offenses. So I think it's absolutely eye-opening. And I think it's also a caution because right now we're seeing politically a lot of people wanting to turn more punitive when it comes to drug use and to selling the opiates. And I don't think that our country wants to go back to just incarcerating people. Like, my hope is really that we can look at it as a disorder and people can actually start getting treatment.
mm, mm. Maybe you could say a little bit more about the kind of numbers and the facts around mass incarceration and how
Um,
that impacts on the African American community.
Well, so the nearly half of Americans today report that they've had an immediate family member in prison or jail. And when it comes to children, there's 2 million children who currently have a family member in prison or in jail, and 10 million that has been the case. And um, when it comes to incarceration numbers for African Americans, even though Black men make up 7% of the US population, they account for 43% of the prison population and 46% held in solitary confinement.
Mhm. And as you show, that has all kinds of other social ramifications in terms of ability to vote, employment, opportunity to receive other kinds of government benefits, etc. So it becomes this self-perpetuating kind of system that of confining a huge portion of the population, the Black population, to a kind of prison without bars.
Absolutely. And like Michelle Alexander argued, that it's a new form of social caste where people who have a conviction are permanently exiled to a type of second-class citizenship.
Mm.
And another startling number, I think I live in Northern California, and I think a lot of people are familiar that we're having a homelessness crisis.
Yeah, right.
A lot of people don't know that 70% of people who are homeless have been incarcerated before.
Mhm.
And like you said, there are a lot of draconian rules around housing where if you've had a conviction before, then you're ineligible for a lot of housing. And at one time, you were ineligible for federal benefits like food stamps, Section 8, student loans. So it really is a ripple effect, not only for people who are locked in a cage, but after when they get out, trying to re-enter society.
Yeah. And on housing, you also have a chapter that deals with the redlining by banks and the withholding of government loans and funding that were available for a lot of veterans and other people to buy homes, and the and what that does, it contributes to the kind of growing inequality, wealth gap with so many African Americans who are not able to accumulate and pass on the generational wealth that comes from home ownership.
Absolutely. And like, for example, where I live in Santa Clara County, also referred to as Silicon Valley, I
Mm.
believe it's like 25% or less of African Americans own their home, whereas for white people, that number is over 60%. And you see that across the country where because the federal government chose to provide loans to white Americans to establish these suburbs, they were able
Mm.
to buy homes in good neighborhoods and then pass that wealth down through the generations. Whereas African Americans, because of redlining, were shut out of that opportunity. And a lot of African Americans, because they couldn't get a federal loan, a federal housing loan, they would have to get a loan that was considered a contract loan, which meant that until you paid that last payment, the home was not considered yours. So
Mm.
if you defaulted or missed a payment at all, they could just take the home back. And you also weren't able to build equity when there was housing like that, and the prices were a lot higher.
Mm. Mm. Well, you discuss a lot of different ways in which in American culture contributed to this kind of identification: Black equals criminal, Black equals danger, and the racial profiling in policing, of course. This we see these kind of tropes employed by politicians, all the time, as a kind of scare tactic.
Yeah.
People in the suburbs, to be trained to see the Black people are going to try to move into your neighborhood, take away your community or something like that. Um, I, you begin. I mean, you you start off by talking about yourself as a mother and about your own son, in school and how you saw that kind of discriminatory profiling of him even as a little child for acting out in the class,
Yeah.
that sort of thing, tendency to kind of see him as a troublemaker, had to be
Mhm.
controlled, had to be punished, and you had the courage to stand up to that and to try to protect your son, whom I guess has survived
Mhm.
this far. Your relief. But could you say a little bit about how that kind of perspective or experience also informs your commitment or passion about this topic?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I do have four children. Well, they're all older now. Two are in high school, two are in college, and I have three boys. And as I discuss in the book, that particularly Black boys and young men are the most heavily policed in America. And it starts as early as preschool, shockingly enough,
Mhm.
with Black students and particularly Black boys being surveilled by teachers and being punished just because they, are Black, unfortunately. And I think because we do have people in our like extended family who are incarcerated, and growing up at the height of the prison boom when I know so many people who have been incarcerated, it was a fear of mine, specifically for my son, because he just he just had so much energy, and he
Mhm.
didn't really conform to the K through 12 sit in your desk and be quiet, which a lot of boys in general don't. And I think a lot of African American boys struggle with our school system. And for me, I saw his self-esteem decrease when he was constantly being picked on, and he was having privileges taken away. And I
Mhm.
felt that this was just because of who he was. When you're in kindergarten, or he was in first grade, and it's like when you're in first grade, what harm are you really causing
Mhm.
your class or your teacher? So it has and like you said, we were able, because we didn't feel that the principal or the administration was really taking it seriously. We did move to a different, smaller Christian school. And like you said, we were fortunate that we had the resources to do that. And specifically, when it comes to African American boys dropping out of high school, I think it stands at about 60% of African American boys who drop out of high school will later go on to be incarcerated.
Mhm.
So later in chapter 8, when I talk about restorative practices being implemented in schools, I think it's really important that there are changes to our educational system where specifically Black children are not being punished or policed or suspended at the rates that they are now, just because it can really change the trajectory of a young person's life.
Yeah, you talk about the so-called kind of classroom to prison pipeline.
Mhm.
Um, the you referred to that chapter on restorative justice, toward the end, and I'd like you to talk about that. Uh, but it does seem to me that before anything else, we really have to have the freedom and openness to have this kind of conversation and to look at these kind of facts that you assembled here, and the fact that now, in many parts of the country there's this specific assault on knowing these things or even talking about them, or this is to talk about racism is racism, and how it's telling a lie about some kind of concept of America. So I think that I mean, first of all, I'd really like to get this book into a lot of people's hands, the ones who need it the most. Uh, but you do try to end on a more positive note, to be talking about some of the ways forward and out of this. Uh, Could you expand a little bit on what that chapter is about, on what the restorative justice, reparations, and repair?
Sure, because I think that especially when you look at something like police violence, I think it can feel so overwhelming,
Mm,
like what can really be done. And like, for example, I never use the words defund the police in the book because we saw the backlash that happened to a term like that I think is like misconstrued. But what I wanted to do was to highlight solutions that are actually being implemented right now. And one of those solutions, or I'd say alternatives that's being implemented, is restorative practices in schools and restorative justice in the criminal legal system. And it's basically, it's a different theory where it looks at harm as a community and relational issue. And it talks about repairing the harm that was caused. And it talks about making whole the person who was harmed and also looking at the person who committed the harm, what was going on with them that they committed that harm in the first place.
mm,
So I think that in schools, like I said, instead of just suspending students or instead of expelling students or literally having police in schools arresting students, I think that it's really important when schools are implementing restorative practices where they're able to. One such practice is called a circle, where everyone who's involved will literally get in a circle and have a talking piece and pass the talking piece from one person to the next. And everyone gets to talk about what happened, the changes that need to happen, and they come up with a plan to so that whatever behavior happened, or if there was a fight, for it not to happen again. And the person who might have been involved will come up with a agreement for how they're going to make right what they did.
mm,
And this is also happening in the criminal legal system as pretrial diversion, where if there was some type of offense that happened, that person will try to repair the harm that they caused instead of being incarcerated. And
mm,
I think that it's really important, especially for juveniles, because like we talked about, if you have a criminal conviction, especially when you're 17, 18 years old, that can affect you for the rest of your life. So if you have an opportunity to look at the harm that was caused, to repair that harm, and to make better choices the next time, I think that benefits everyone. And just one other thing I wanted to say about restorative justice, especially in the criminal sphere, is that it's really victim centered. And I think that in our system right now, victims are very much so sidelined and ignored.
mm,
So I think that a lot of people who advocate for restorative justice do so because victims really benefit from the process, the restorative process, and that they feel more empowered by it versus people who are victims feeling victimized and like they are sidelined and not heard in the way that our justice system operates right now.
mm. You mentioned in the beginning how you were inspired by Michelle Alexander, you know, not just her analysis of this problem, but her saying that it's a moral and spiritual problem. It's not just a social, political kind of issue. Uh, and in the last chapter, or conclusion, you really step forward with your Catholic voice, not so much through the rest of the book, but at that point to talk about why these issues are particularly important and why they should be seen by Christians, Catholics, uh, as a kind of gospel challenge.
Mhm, mhm. Absolutely. And I think that Jesus does call all Christians to look at the people that he terms the least of these, people who are hungry, people who are thirsty, people who are sick, people who are imprisoned, and to really see Jesus in those people. And that has motivated me also. And as you will see after you read the book, unfortunately, African American people are the least of these in so many of the circumstances in our society today.
Mhm.
And when it really comes to poverty and when it comes to issues of mass incarceration and police violence, African Americans are bearing the brunt of this. And I do believe that it's because of the anti-Black racism that's so intertwined in our system because of slavery, because of American apartheid, we call Jim Crow. And it's just manifested today in a different way.
Have you experienced reception, in Catholic circles for this challenge that you're posing?
Well, I'm excited to see after people read the book if, like you said, if they will accept the challenge. I'm
Mhm.
excited to see, and I hope that people do read it, and I hope that there is a conversation that started, because that was one of my goals, just to start the conversation, because I think that, like, for example, the new Jim Crow, that might be read by a certain group of people.
Mhm.
And what I was hoping was to bring that type of conversation to Catholic spaces where a lot of times we're not having that type of conversation or
Mhm.
reading those type of books.
Mhm. Well, one of the real powers of the book, I think, is your skill as a storyteller, maybe because of your experience as a novelist. But there's really a narrative, and each of the chapters, often begins with a story about a particular person, uh, and really makes the issue, come to light. So this is, not just a book for academics or kind of sociology nerds or something. It's, I think, really an accessible book. It could easily be taught in schools if they would allow that, and I hope they will. Um, so I really want to thank you, Alessandra, for joining me today, and for writing, I think, a terrific and very important book. I'm very proud that we published this at Orbis. In the Shadow of Freedom, The Enduring Call for Racial Justice, from Orbis Books, by Alessandra Harris. Thank you
Thank
very
you
much.
for having me.
You bet.